Okay guys, Brent Hull Build Show. A couple weeks ago we shared part one of the historic precedent, that talk I gave at the ASHI convention, home inspectors. And so it was a fun talk. We talked about building, styles. Part two is kind of moving into more of a modern era and kind of what happens and what changes in building. So check it out, let me know what you think. Now we're going to go into the arts and crafts era, and then we're talking more about kind of the challenges in this time. You know, there's the ones we've finished. Here's what we've got in front of us, and we'll start with the arts and crafts era. Arts and crafts is a ideological movement. Okay, it's not necessarily just an architectural style. It had to do with textiles. It had to do with, you know, the way people thought about, you know, design, the rejection of the Victorian stuff. That ornamentation and that excitement wanes and falls apart by the 1890s, early 1900s. And so, at least on the design side. And so you have this prairie, craftsman, and bungalow style homes that are a part of this arts and crafts movement. You have key designers like Gustav Stickley, Frank Lloyd Wright, the Green brothers out in California, and we'll talk about kit homes as well. So there is a rejection of the Victorian ornamentation and over ornamentation, okay? Just like I sneer at McMansions because they're gaudy and too big, and it's all about, you know, more granite countertops and stupid crowns, and so, Brent bias. They are looking at Victorian houses saying the same thing. And so you have this rejection of that ornamentation. Let's get back to a simple, honest home construction, home style. And so you have a change of taste. And furniture looking much more like this. If you look at this transition, okay, it starts with the Crystal Palace, which was an exposition in England where they built basically a cast iron huge exhibition, right, where people were walking through, and there were stories of people being afraid to walk through the glass thing. They're afraid it's going to fall down because they basically built this cast iron frame and then put glass in all the openings, and so there's this big, you know, glass structure. And it blew people away. John Ruskin, Pugin, who I talked about, were proponents for the Gothic. They're proponents for the handmade. William Morris and his group of buddies are starting to build things that have this different design aesthetic. The colors are browns and earth tones, not these bright primary colors. And they're wanting to get back to a crafted, well-crafted time period. They are having a proliferation of cheap products being built and delivered to their houses. And they're saying, why can't things be well made? Okay, maybe we're saying the same things today. And so you have this movement going on, and that's what Americans tap into, guys like Gustav Stickley with his magazine, The Craftsman, and the Green brothers tap into this ideal that Americans are holding on to, that they want this pure arts and crafts house. Now this is kind of the Victorian interior. It was a cluttered interior. It was you know, crap everywhere, and gaudy things as well, and poorly made things. So it wasn't just rooms where you had these things. A lot of times they were cheaply and poorly made. And so this is kind of that Victorian interior and that the Victorian time, a lot of clutter. This is what Gustav Stickley is promoting in his magazines, you know, simple moldings. They talk about honest joinery. So instead of having big, you know, cut brackets, they would have, you know, this simple bracket. That's why there's arts and crafts and craftsman houses just have a simple kind of angle piece that goes up that supports the eave, because it's functional ornamentation. It has a purpose. It's not there by accident. This is Craftsman's Farms, which was a Stickley experiment that he had. Look at those two buildings, built probably within 10 years of each other. One of the things that was very attractive and very influential to Frank Lloyd Wright, to Gustav Stickley, as well as to the Green brothers in California, was this pavilion. This is at the Columbus Fair and Exhibition in Chicago, 1896 World Fair. The Japanese set up this pagoda. And we know that Frank Lloyd Wright and the Green brothers both saw this and were struck by the wide open eaves that shed out over the house, the joinery, the woodwork. I mean, if you look at that woodwork on the bottom side of that, and you look at this room there, you see a lot of those same similarities on the right. That kind of, simple timber joinery was very popular at that time because of what the influence of this World's Fair and seeing that at that time. Gustav Stickley, he's probably the influencer of the age, right? He's the guy who is huge for a little bit of time. He was just a powerful influencer. He had a magazine called The Craftsman. He built a 15-story building in New York City where he was selling everything from pottery to forks and knives to textiles to furniture to houses. And so he's very influential. He goes from probably 1905, and then he's literally bankrupt, I think, by 1915. And so it's a very short window of when he's influential, but he does, the Craftsman style homes are named after the things that he was promoting in his magazine, The Craftsman. Again, this is from Virginia McAllister's book. You see some of these details and what this thing looked like. Low slung roofs, the functional bracketing that goes outside, simple columns, inviting porches, but certainly very different from the Victorian houses. You're also seeing kind of the working man's house, that this house, because of the improved technology in building, because of stick framing, houses are cheaper to build. And so you actually have, in this period, the working man's house, and a very affordable house for people to build and to have good looking. This is also a very American style. This is not really a style that you see in Europe. I've got some people from Australia that have reached out to me, said they have this period, but this is a very American ideal. And the influencers were, both also American. This is the Gamble House in California. Probably my favorite house in America. Just the craftsmanship's unbelievable inside. Charles and Henry Green were both studied as woodworkers, and so they had a very high standard for what quality was. But this is 1909, tail end of the Victorian period. If you go into Pasadena and look around the Victorian houses built at this same time, this must have been a radical departure from what was being built at the time. This is the interior, this is the stair hall. It's amazing how they built it and put it together. There's probably 4 or 5 green houses in that neighborhood in Pasadena where he built a number of them. And these brothers too were extremely popular from 1905, but they were too out of business by 1920. So this is a kind of a short-lived time period. The Prairie style is really about the Prairie School of Architecture up in Chicago. Frank Lloyd Wright obviously being the main guy, but there's a number of architects that are building in that style, and they are being influenced by the wide open prairie, the long, low-slung prairie. And you're going to see when we look at this house, and I'm going to point out some of the things, that the ranch period that happens in the 50s, mid-century modern, is really a copy of a lot of the things Frank Lloyd Wright was doing in 1909, 1910. So, you wonder, I used to wonder why everybody considered Frank Lloyd Wright such a genius, but really seeing what he was doing in 1909 that isn't really copied by mass builders and things until 1940 or 50 speaks to his genius. Basically, you have these horizontal lines, and this is, in a very general term, modern houses tend to be low horizontal lines, and classical houses tend to be upright and vertical lines. And so you see that in window panes, you see that in this case, on this house, he actually had the mortar joints on the brick all one color, and then the vertical mortar joints were stained to match the color of the brick. So all you see is kind of those horizontal lines going on there. That banding that he's got there, the cut stone banding that goes across there, all reflecting this horizontality. The open floor plan, that's a Frank Lloyd Wright thing that you see in the Roby house, where there's not a bunch of these dividing walls. You're actually looking through a number of these different areas. And so he was doing things, that fireplace, where's the flue, right? He had built it and designed it so that the flue wasn't even over top. He was just doing things that other people weren't doing. Probably around the same time, beginning at the early part of it, you start to have kit houses. Certainly, if you've heard about the Sears and Roebuck is involved in this business, Montgomery Ward's was in this business. Aladdin may have been the biggest one. But you have kit house builders. If you look at, it's interesting as I studied this, is that a lot of these houses were built for people who couldn't afford a regular house. So think about these being almost kit cars, like something that I can't afford a real car, I'm going to take a VW engine and put a cool body on it or something. Some kind of parallel I'm trying to draw there. These houses were cheaper. They did get constructed faster. These were very popular on farms. Obviously, we're a very rural culture at the turn of that century. And so the idea of not having to hire a builder and get all these things, and that literally your home, in the Sears case, came in 2 or 3 boxcars, and that they would be sent to your deal. The boxcars would be taken off, and over a few week period, you would unload those boxcars, and literally the tile for your bathroom, the mortar, a lot of studs were sometimes pre-cut. All your windows, all your doors, everything came in these kits. It's pretty fascinating. Aladdin is the longest company. They were around till the 80s. But Sears and Roebuck, you see there that they built 60 to 70,000 of these houses between 1908 and 1940. Gordon Van Tyne, we've seen one of his catalogs, Montgomery Ward's. So there was a number of companies involved in this, but it was certainly and I think as you guys, has anybody gone and inspected a Sears house? Nice. Well built? Yeah? I mean, the materials were good, right? And so it's interesting how it happened. Some covers of a Montgomery Ward's catalog on the left, a Sears catalog on the right. Look at the way the colonnade and the doors are coming to this house. I'm not sure that scaffolding's up to OSHA code, but it's pretty interesting seeing these houses and how they're put together, the materials that they are providing. It speaks to the fact that Sears and Montgomery Ward could get into the building supply business speaks to the standardization of that industry and how these things were made. The biggest years for Sears were 29 to 31. Obviously, the Great Depression put a damper on things. They had a tough time figuring out how to finance these houses and how to get it so they were affordable to people, and they ended up figuring that out. I think they had good designers, and so you end up with houses. This is their best house. This is the Magnolia. If you look at their catalogs from that period, they would go from cheaper houses to kind of this house. If you can see it down here, it says downspouts, sash weights, hardware, colonnades, casings, wood trim, eaves, troughs, paint. I mean, right? Isn't that crazy? The Martha Washington and kind of the simple houses. Of course, Aladdin was one of the bigger ones. Ready cut. These houses did, I think, all the studs were cut. Sometimes, I think it was Aladdin, they actually had notches in the plates so you know where to stick your stud. So it was definitely kind of build it yourself, or certainly trying to encourage that. And as we look at DIY, kind of towards the end of this talk, we'll talk more about that. But that's a very interesting time, but I'm glad you guys have seen some of these houses. Jumping into the period revival, and this is where, building gets a little bit sticky, and we start to see this, the quality of housing start going down, especially after World War II, but it starts a little bit here. The period revival era, 1920 to 1940 is kind of it's very much an inspired from the past. Remember, we've come from the Victorian led to the arts and crafts, which was a rejection of that ornamentation. The period revival is let's look around and find out where the most beautiful architecture is. And because of what was happening in the world at that time, the European influence and the colonial revival influence became a really big deal. The World War II ends 1918. America turns 150 in 1926. And then the Great Depression, of course, is in the 30s. And so you have a period of time there where the Roaring 20s and some of the best houses, I think, stylistically are built in that 20s period. What was it inspired from? It's certainly true that there was a lot of architects who spent time in World War I in Europe enchanted by what they saw, enchanted by the cottages and the houses and the farms of Normandy and in France and all over Europe, and just said, wow, this is the kind of architecture we need to be building. Samuel Chamberlain, who drew these things, was an architect who went over to Europe and just spent, he was at World War I, came back, went back to Europe, and just went around sketching and drawing things up because he was so enamored by this architecture, by the age, by the character. Travel was much easier as well. So going over and you see the cruise lines and the advertising that they were doing, that the ease of travel, especially after World War I, enabled people to go to Europe like they never had before. And so a number of confluences of cultural influences were taking place that caused this excitement. This is a house we worked on in Fort Worth, 1928. John Staub was a prodigious architect who, like many of these others, had spent World War I there and then went back to study in Europe and actually saw that scalloped, gable end there in Europe. Now that looks Dutch or looks from Holland or something, and it possibly was, but it was a house that he saw in England that he was rebuilding back in America. Another architect named Charles Dilbeck, he studied houses like this. He had one book in his library in his thing, and it was a book on Normandy, France, and he was building these thatched roof, timbered houses with tons of character and tons of detail. And his plans for one of these houses we did was 3 sheets. And in those sheets, they were just cram-packed with these, Juliet balconies and tons of character and tons of details built into these houses, leaded glass, shingles. This is not the original roof, but tons of character in these houses, all inspired from Europe. And the interiors with a lot of timber framing was part of that story. There's a whole style of housing called the storybook housing, Hollywood storybook. And there's some books written about it, where these Hansel and Gretel-ish houses were built with all this kind of character and storybook styling that looks like something from a Hansel and Gretel or a Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs drawings from Disney. So it's a popular, it's a romantic, it's a delightful style that people are attached to. The builder magazines, developers were all enamored by this same thing, where you would see the covers of the magazines and the cover thing promoting this European styled, European influenced architecture, and the type of things they would do with stone mixed with brick, conveying this age and conveying this detail. It's quite amazing. Within this period revival style, you have English and Tudor revival, you have Mediterranean, there's French, there's colonial revival. So there's a number of revival styles that are part of this. And if you've driven through a neighborhood from the 1920s, 1930s, you've seen these cute little quaint houses that were all part of that era. Just specifically on the English Tudor revival, the inspiration was the Elizabethan houses and houses from the Tudor period, as well as timber framed houses like this. This is 1577 in England, and this the reason you see timbering like you see in the gable end, timbering over the windows, is because of the inspiration that comes from those original Tudor and French style houses. Now, I talked about that kind of slippery slope where we go down. A lot of these houses, and I think I said earlier, I went to a Tudor revival house with a colonial revival interior. Most houses at this time, only about 2%, and it's still not a very high percentage today, were actually designed by architects. Most of these houses were designed by plan book authors and builders. Okay, so that was where the majority of the design ideals came from. And there was top architects that would have been designing this time, but most houses were not architecturally driven, or a big name architect really driving all the details in the house. Instead, it was a plan book picture that they saw. They might have bought through a builder magazine or a ladies' home journal, and then they worked out the details in the field. This is a 1925 house in Fort Worth. Notice in between the timbering, they've got the herringbone and the different brick patterns, which are very popular at that period. The chimney pots, the cut stone around the window, all part of that kind of ideal. And I think these houses are among the most charming houses built in America. And I think it's because of the scale and the detail combined to really make something charming. There's certainly a French influence at this time, and you look at kind of 3 distinct regions of France where it's happening. up in the north in the Normandy area, in the Loire Valley, and then down in Provence where you get the southern France and you get into that Mediterranean styling. Loire Valley was the richest part of France. It was where all the traffic and the trade came through up the Seine River into Paris, and so you have the biggest houses and the turrets and this kind of typical French detailing that's over the top. This is probably an 1860s house in France, and of course this is up in Normandy. That's probably 1650s house, and so but. Architects and designers in America would look at a project like this, look at the tile roof. A lot of manufacturers were involved in this. The White Pine series, if you don't know about that, is a colonial revival study of early building in America in the 20s and 30s. The Tuileries was a Ludovici tile, publication that they sent to architects where they went and studied buildings like this, looked at the tile and how you can make that tile today. So a lot of people were involved in creating these styles and giving them authenticity with the products that could, make them much better. Now, southern France, one of the things you notice is the low pitch roofs, and the low pitch roofs because there's no snow load in the south, and the high pitch roofs because they're trying to manage the snow load. You realize that a lot of these styles are invented or kind of grow up organically in these regions because for the last 500 years they've been building that way, and they don't build low pitch roofs in Normandy because the snow destroyed the houses that were that way, and so everybody learned to build with steep pitch roofs. So you have the Cotswold or Normandy, you have this style of housing and this style of detail that we then copy, but realize that it grew organically, and we're trying to copy that organic look. A lot of the period revival houses are a mix, like this house with the arched windows on the left. You've got timbering with brick, and then you've got timbering with stucco. I just call this a European influence. I don't think it's necessarily purely English or purely French, but it's certainly part of that period revival story. Same thing is true in the Mediterranean area. You'll see Mediterranean design, Mediterranean details. This is down in southern Italy and the Amalfi Coast where these kind of details come in. You see a lot of ironwork, tile roofs. Certainly in the Italian area and what Palladio was doing and the way he was building his houses with a mix of classicism and rural grit kind of, inform the houses we build. Now, I don't consider this a particularly handsome house, but it's a period revival house, influenced with the barrel tile roofs, probably Mediterranean revival, but just kind of a mix of kind of a weird mix of just kind of stylistically. And so I don't think it should be expected that you walk up to this house and go, oh, that's because it's not. It's kind of a weird house. But you should walk up to this house and be able to go, yeah, this is 1920s house, and that front door is not original, right? So you can look at the Home Depot special there in that front door and realize that this kind of was put together and which parts stand out, at least in my eye, of what are original and what isn't. Certainly the colonial revival. If you think that I said the colonial Williamsburg was built up in the 20s with the help of Rockefeller, the Mount Vernon Ladies Society was the people that saved Mount Vernon. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, Mount Vernon was falling down, right? It was decaying, and these ladies got together and said, we need to raise money to keep this house going. It's crazy to me to think that George Washington's house would have just been neglected. Monticello was the same way. There was a famous doctor who bought Monticello and kept it for years and years and years and years, keeping it up until it could be properly restored and kind of brought back to his thing. But these houses are so influential in that colonial revival era, and they end up driving the colonial revival style in the 20s all the way up into the early 40s, as you'll see from these plan books. Now, this is an example there's a great book of house styles called Small Houses of Distinction, great houses from the 1920s. If you look at plan book houses from the 1920s, you'll begin to see this kind of cottagey kind of house that isn't necessarily any of pure style. And so we'll get more into that as we go forward. A little bit smaller 1920s house, again, period revival. Another one with kind of a weird collection of a barrel tile roof with a cat swoop like Tudor thing. So again, I'm showing examples of not perfect things, but certainly during that period revival era. It's interesting, there's a few websites you guys may have been on as far as how housing technology advances and what technology is in these houses and when. This one is you know, you look at the running water coming into the houses in the 1880s. If you look at the running water here, most of the big technological jumps don't happen in between 20s and the 40s is when a lot of those things really happen. Because I think running water is like here, and for a long time, less than 50% of houses in 1920 had running water in them, and then it kind of blows up through there. Light bulb, the stove, a lot of those things were invented in the 1850s, but don't really have strong adoption until the 1920s, 1930s. So a lot of good things technologically wise happen in houses in that 20s to 40s period. This is a 1927 catalog with the telephone niches. And if you're as old as I am and you watch shows like Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver, there's that central phone at the bottom of the stairs, and that's where, of course, there's one phone line in those houses, and they would have architectural details and elements like this that would be part of that story. Kitchens is something that the modern kitchen really isn't a thing until probably 1910, 1915 at the earliest. There is a great book called Kitchens Plan Book. It was by the Hoosier Cabinet Company. I think it's a 1927 contest, but it was basically an architectural contest for kitchens. And what they basically found was that kitchens were purposefully designed to be small spaces because they were meant to be efficient workspaces. Literally, this platform that I'm standing on would have been a perfect kitchen. It's probably 18 by 13, because it would have been very few steps, right? You wouldn't have to walk very far to get to different things. The early triangle design idea of a kitchen with the sink and the stove and the refrigerator was just happening, but they're very small spaces. So if you go into a bungalow house, 20s and 30s, that's why those kitchens were small, is they were a workspace. And the kitchen, seeing it evolve, doesn't really become the McMansion era, Corian countertop wonder place until the 70s and 80s. And so up until that time, it's separated from the rest of the house. It's not an important space. It's a servant's area. I mean, this is a 1921 catalog there on the bottom left. That is, no uppers, mostly cabinets only on one wall, sink above, window above, below a sink, sink below a window, Hoosier cabinet-ish kind of thing on the right, stove, freestanding stove on the left. That's what kitchens looked like. This is that 1920s Hoosier Cabinet Company, and they actually, there was the Taylor efficiency study thing where they talked about how few number of steps you'd have to take on that kitchen on the right. And you can see that that's a very small space. I don't see a dimension on there, but they were small spaces. I think the thing I look at as an architectural critic and kind of a guy who gets frustrated with McMansions is this too, is there's a lot of period revival houses being built today, especially in Texas, that are French and Mediterranean, that are Disneyland on drugs and just are bad. So now, I think that what happens here after World War II is this explosion and really building. You're already showing you influences of it, but it's really after World War II that building turns to crap. And here's Brent getting heavily biased, right? But you'll see why, and you'll see what's going on with building and how it influences houses today. First thing is that the architect and the architect training changed, okay? In the 1920s, if you wanted a Mediterranean revival house, you could talk to an architect, and he was designing both commercial buildings and residential buildings. I mean, if you think of Frank Lloyd Wright, 95% of his buildings were residential buildings. And if you talk to Frank Gehry today or a big name architect, 2%, if that, are residential houses. So there's been a split between the way the architect approaches residential building, and residential building is poo-pooed and looked down upon. If you want to be a serious architect, you're not designing houses. And so you go to by 1950, and there was the thing William Levitt was designing on the left, and the Seagram's building by Mies van der Rohe on the right, and you can see this split taking place, that there is no architect, there is no leading designer in home design today, and it's affecting how houses are built, how things are put together, how things are constructed, and it's a big problem. How did we get here? If you think that the Great Depression is 1929, if you look at housing starts in 1926, there was 1 million housing starts, but it slowly starts going down 27, 28, 29, so that by 33, there's like 10% of that. 100,000 houses were built in 33. I think it was the low point. But even today, 1 million houses a year is kind of a that you'll keep up with demand if you can keep 1 million houses a year, but just remember that. World War II starts in 41 for us, goes through 45. GIs start coming home in 46. So almost, if you consider 26 to 46, an almost 20-year period where there's very little housing being built and it's very depressed. During the war years, okay, in 42 and 43, there's actually, you couldn't build a house, okay, because of the War Protection Bureau. It was WPA, but it wasn't the Works Progress Administration. It was basically they were trying to pull together all the rubber that they needed, all the glass that they needed. They didn't want things spending on housing that they could put towards the war effort. And so, that middle one, how to keep busy in wartime, how to build with what you can get. In other words, there was very few building supplies. There was a moratorium on building, and so it was a very difficult time, just stressing the fact that no houses were being built. So by, I think that's a 50 cover of Time magazine, William Levitt is on it as a hero, right? He is a very complex, crazy dude that in some ways he is it was a genius. And in other ways, he started an avalanche of problems that I think still affect building today. He started out building with his family. And so in the 20s, he was doing those period revival houses that we were just looking at. He got a contract to build defense housing in 41 in Norfolk, Virginia, basically Quonset hut type buildings. And he came back to New York after that experience, ready to build a different house and ready to build, basically, he started Levittown out of New York in 47, 17,000 houses, and then Levittown in Pennsylvania. I think there's 4 Levittowns, 6 house styles, 17,000 houses there. Basically, the average house size in 1927, let's say, is about 1,400 square feet. He starts building houses that are 600 and 800 square feet. Okay, slab foundation, he's the start of slab foundations. So there was no basements, they were very small, but the price was incredible. And basically, he broke down the housing process into 26 steps. There's stories of he broke labor unions. Instead of having unions that would, frame the house, sheet the house, roof the house, hang the doors and trim, he was hiring a group all they did was frame houses. And then another all they did was sheet houses. He had people walking around with a blue bucket of paint and a red bucket of paint. And so he broke the housing, the process of building. And in fact, he would say, I'm not a builder, I'm a manufacturer. And he knew he was completely vertically integrated. He knew how many nails went into his house. And so in one sense, it's like, wow, that's incredible. He's like an Elon Musk approaching how we should build houses and how we make them efficient. On the other side, he basically taught a generation or two of builders how to build cheap and fast. Because what they essentially found was that in 46, with 16 million GIs coming back from the war, there was no housing. And there's stories and articles written about how people were saying, they were doubling up, how they were living in silos, how they were living in train cars, that there was just no housing. And so the focus of the home building industry went, we got to build houses really fast and really cheap. And that, gentlemen, is why houses suck today, is because he taught this generation to quit thinking about beauty, quit thinking about craft, and just build and go. If you look at, this is his one of his warehouses where he had his plans, his supplies laid out. There are all the materials that he would have for a house. And a big development in 1926 would have been 300 houses. That would have been if you were a production builder building 300 houses, you were top of the market. He's building houses by the thousands. And the stories go is that when they would come out of New York to look at his houses, they were renting apartments in New York for $50 to $100 a month, that they would oftentimes have to share bathrooms down the hall from people. Realize that for 20 years, not only were there no houses being built, but those tenement houses or even the apartments they were living in weren't being fixed up either. So you shared your bathroom with your neighbor, right? They would come out to Levittown and he would say, if you're a vet, you didn't even have to have a down payment. But for $50 a down payment and $50 a month, he would sell 1,000 houses in a weekend. I mean, it's just changed the way houses were built, changed the way he was doing things. And, he gave them their own bathroom and they had a washer and dryer. He was having to teach people how to mow the grass because they didn't know how to mow the grass, right? Had a plant tree, had a backyard, and people were freaking out, and kind of rightly so, with how different things were. And you wonder when urban flight happens, when people are fleeing to the suburbs, this is that time. And from the 50s into the 70s, right, urban decay happens and people are moving out to the suburbs because housing changed so dramatically. The house of Levittown, those are the house styles. And what he would do is there would be 4 to 6 house styles, and he would just plop them differently on the lot so that they looked different. He was the first one to do windy roads through his neighborhood so it didn't look like cookie cutter houses, even though he was building cookie cutter houses. So it's genius, right? And so, he was doing things where your kids are never going to have to cross a busy street to go to school, that you don't have to drive very far to go to the grocery store. And so modern living really happens with him at this time, and it changes everything. Design, unfortunately, does take a back seat. I mean, his brother was an architect and, was always complaining because Levitt never listened to him. Kind of a big brother, little brother fight going on. But this is when the rise of the production builders happens. This is when everybody learned how to build cheap and fast, and all over the country, the Pulte's, Centex's, all of those companies grow up in the 1950s, and this is when this starts. But realize that these houses had no hardwood floors, they were slab foundations, they were non-operable windows, there was just cheap, and all of the things that had defined quality building in the 20s was thrown out the window. And you see, I'm going to go through some plan book photos as you see housings change. Modernism begins to show up in these houses, but they're simple, they're small, and kind of have a colonial revival-ish feel, but design is not real central to the idea. Certainly the mid-century modern, the ranch period is part of this construction, is part of these details. This is when housing changes. Now, realize too that everybody's involved. It's not just William Levitt, the evil villain. Architects and everybody is fighting the same battle, trying to figure out how to do this. The Stahl house was a house designed by architects to be reproducible. Basically, it was like a prefab, well-designed house. And of course, this is a famous photo from that time period, but they were looking for solutions too of how we can build houses like we build cars, so that it has good design, but it's a bunch of reproducible parts. And this is where a lot of the building materials that had never been used in housing begin to be used in housing, like big plate glass windows, like steel, aluminum, all of those different materials that kind of make up this modern house. Finally, too, you have the mid-century design, the ranch design. Now, what are we, 40 years after Frank did the Roby house, and now we're going back to this low pitched roof, long horizontal lines, open floor plans, all things that he had thought of and done 40 years before. This is modernism. This is the Farnsworth house, Mies van der Rohe. I've done a whole study on this house, and there's a bunch of interesting things that this is still actually follows classical, golden ratio things, but he's one of the few that it does that with. This is that case study, the Stahl house. The house must be capable of duplication and in no sense be an individual performance. Right? This is let's make houses cheap and fast, even from the architectural side. Guys like Joseph Eichler out in California, he was a production builder who teamed up with top architects. And if you wonder where this ranch style look with the beams that come through, it's almost arts and crafts in its simplicity, but it was driven by a desire to be inexpensive. So we look at some of the interiors of these houses, and if you look at just a picture of the thing on the right and just this house in general, there really is no trim. Okay, there's no millwork package necessarily. You've got wood planks in the ceiling, and then these beams, large plates of glass, open floor plans. Remember, the fewer the walls that they're building, the cheaper it is, and so you're seeing a design piece happening here, but it's also the costs are way down. If you look at building magazines at this time, there's a housing boom from the 50s to the 70s, really that 20-year period I was talking about, when they're building, if you look at those numbers, 2 million units, and they're well over 1 million units for that time period that I got circled. So this is, you see that in 43, they're less than 1 million houses, 100,000 houses, and then in, what is it, in 10 years, they're at 2 million, right? So just, they're blowing out houses as fast as possible. The covers of these American Builder magazines that just 20 years before had been cute and quaint now are all about speed and production. This is a 1927 Colonial Revival cover, right? That's charm, character, beauty, right? And look at those business guys on the right. There's an efficient house behind us. We're ready to do business. Same thing here. You got a European English Revival house, and then them talking about prefabs there on the right, and how to make a house as cheap and efficient as possible. I don't look at this and fault them. I don't look at it and go, these idiots. I just look at it and go, shoot, because I know where this leads. Because I look at the crap being built today, and I look back at this and I go, this is where it started. American Builder talking about prefab housing, and that becomes a big buzzword that's happening in the building industry from the 50s into the 70s, trying to influence how things are put together, and just these quick, efficient, how to build faster. A lot of the products that you see that come about in this time period, plywood may be the most unrealized as far as how important it is to the building industry today. Plywood, of course, is invented in the 1850s or 60s, used mostly for furniture into the early, late 19th century, late 1800s. Sam Maloof, who's a furniture maker, wrote a book that when he got out of the war, he was hired by the government to write a pamphlet on how to use plywood to build things in your home. And so plywood was something that the government was getting behind people to say, hey, this is another way we can build cheap and fast. You can do it yourself. You can do these things. And so you see the guy in the bottom right, updating, his house, covering up that old wallpaper with the plywood paneling he's got, in that box there. Weldwood, of course, you guys may remember those walls growing up. I certainly do. Those walnut and the fake woods and the fake materials that they were putting together to create these spaces. This was a wonder product. And you think about all the wood products and certainly sheet products that we have, the chipboard, all the wood that we sheathe our houses with and sheathe our decks with and build our cabinets with is just taken over compared to 200 years ago when everything was made with solid wood, even cabinets. Concrete block was obviously a big part of that time period. They had these famous designers like Marcel Breuer, coming up with these designs that people could use these. And the thing about a concrete block is it's a modular block that you can build with over and over again, trying to help people design and help people do things more with this cheap, fast, quick material. Windows begin to, the plate glass windows certainly, float glass is essentially up until about 1940, most glass was cylinder glass. It was blown cylinder glass that was then laid out, graded, A through C as far as quality. Float glass, which basically comes off from a perpetual machine, has no deficiencies in it and can be made in huge sizes. And so the reason why I grew up, running through the sliding glass doors is because plate glass was this new invention of huge pieces of glass that you see in windows like this. Of course, anybody grew up with that window in their house? Maybe one or two. Remember those things. Hollow core doors is a post-World War II invention. Have you ever seen the inside of a hollow core door? The cardboard insert and everything else? They're a mess. Moldings. I give whole talks on moldings and molding styles and everything. I believe that you can reach in the past and pull your hand and pull a molding from any period of time, and I can look at it and tell you when it was made. Because architectural styles and are so distinctive, a Georgian versus a federal molding versus a clamshell molding. And if you look at just the sizing of moldings going from that 6-inch Georgian to a very big Greek Revival and Victorian moldings, by the time you get to the clamshell molding, the 2.5, 3-inch clamshell molding, or even today the smaller moldings you get at the big box stores, we have certainly changed the way we build. So, the material change that's happening, if you think about between World War II, before and after, most floors are wood floor or tile, right? In a 1920s house. After that, it's asphalt and linoleum. Easy for me to say. It's just, think about the expense and the quality of the materials that we used to put into houses versus the things that we put in there today. Wood sheeting and plaster on interior walls versus drywall. If you look at the sheeting on the outside of the house, you guys as inspectors would know, there are houses they're building in Texas right now where the sheathing is basically cardboard. And I don't know how it gets past any kind of engineering code or anything else, but literally it's probably less than 1/8 of an inch thick, and you can push your hand through it. And that's the sheathing that's put on the outside of these houses. So it's a problem. Tile countertops versus plastic, laminate, and formica. The starter house that was 1,400 square feet, I told you that. And then wood windows and doors versus aluminum and hollow core doors. Certainly the aluminum window post 1940 and 50 is the cheap, quick, fast window. Isn't very energy efficient, but is cheap and fast. And then, the last one I'm doing here is the garages and the changes in the garage that you have. What is that? About 95% of all households have a garage like this. Going back to those early floor plans of the 40s where you have a detached garage. And this is kind of the last period of the detached garage. And then houses begin to be incorporated. If you go to the 20s, their garages are an important architectural feature and, oftentimes have a living area above, but definitely incorporate into the styling and the detailing of the house with nice materials and nice details going into them, right? I mean, just good architectural bones. And then by the time the overhead door, I think this is late 40s is when the overhead door company comes out with their styling. And then, of course, the garage fronting face of these houses that starts in the 1950s speaks to the power of the car and how it influences our architecture and the buildings that we live in. But if you want to know really quickly as you're looking at a 1950s, 60s house, just that garage front facing with that front center driveway, gone are the front porches. Now we live in our backyards of the houses. We don't longer live in the front. And it's kind of changed the way we live. All right, so last section is just about modernism, just kind of how that influences. And I think modernism, and I've kind of alluded to it in this talk, when we start seeing early modernism. I think, the Green and Greenhouse out in California, that was so modern and hip. Frank Lloyd Wright's house, the Roby House in 1909. And then we go through that 20s period, and then architecturally we have a split between the residential and commercial, and you start to see Art Deco construction, Art Deco architecture in civic buildings, and its influence in this split between where the architect is involved in residential design. And then post World War II, It's an interesting deal. If you've ever lamented that the classical architecture, why can't our buildings be beautiful anymore? This really starts in this time period. And one of the reasons why a lot of countries rejected classical architecture and classical design was because of Hitler. One of the things Hitler did was Hitler hated modern art and modern design. The Bauhaus School, which is a design school that actually came back over here to Harvard through Walter Gropius. Gropius was a teacher at the Bauhaus School in Germany, and when Hitler was coming into power in the 30s, closed the Bauhaus School because it was too modern, it was too avant-garde. He wanted all classical things. And so he had an architect, you can look it up, I think Robert Stern did a book on Albert Speer. Albert Speer was a classicist who basically designed what Germany and Berlin was going to look like, when they did their whole world. And there's fascinating pictures, fascinating design, and classicism began to be associated with fascism. And so there was a rejection of that from the architectural schools and people in general. And Mies van der Rohe, who had taught at the Bauhaus, went to Chicago. Walter Gropius left the Bauhaus School and came to Harvard Design School. And you have, over about the next 10 or 15 years, all the architecture schools moving towards modernism and turning their back on classicism. Realize too that, and this is some of my talks that I do on the Build Show and my YouTube channel, is that one reason why we can't design good houses today is that architects are not trained in traditional design and traditional details. And so they are, you say, well, what does that mean? Well, there's a group called the ICAA, Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. The main chapter's in New York, but there's probably 25 chapters around the country. There's one in Texas. We tried to take our weekend program to the University of Texas and said, hey, we'd like to teach these classical ideals. And the University of Texas staff said, you're not coming onto our campus. Like, why would you? There is hostility to this classical ideal and classical design today. And it is the detriment of our houses and what's being built that guys don't know how to do a proper front porch with a column that supports a beam with a pediment and what that even should look like, because we've lost the art of building, and that's just kind of one example of it. Just the way magazines change here. Ladies Home Journal with House Beautiful in the 20s. Remember Real Simple magazine and Dwell? I mean, that guy is sitting in front of a black box, right? That's the future of housing, according to Dwell. These shapes, this is from Virginia McAllister's book, right? These modern shapes, the A-frame, these deconstruction design, brutalism, which is raw concrete, all kind of a mix of things that you'll notice and see. Realize that, this is Mies van der Rohe, this is a chapel in 1952. This is when Adolf Loos said ornament is a crime, okay? And so there's this whole movement away from any kind of ornamentation. So, this thing looks like a two-story strip mall, right? Is a chapel, okay? And so all the ornamentation is gone, the steeple is gone. There's nothing to indicate that this is a chapel, and so it's just a mess. Sorry, I do have strong opinions. So, I mean, if you look at, housing before 1960, we talked about the handmade era up into the 1850s, the industrialization that changes, the balloon framing and all of those things, Victorian period revival, and then of course the problem with William Levitt in the 40s. After this time, after Levitt, you have urban flight, people leaving downtown, the rise of McMansion, that was a term coined in the 1980s, of course our housing crisis, and then of course Chip and Joanna Gaines from Waco. There's been a split, and there's been a problem, and you see it in things like this. This is another Texas classic. Look at that column. It's sitting on barrel tiles. We've forgotten how to build, and it's a problem. You look at the Craftsman style house on the left, which everything in that house is designed around a philosophy and ideal, right? The moldings were unpainted because you wanted to see the natural beauty of the wood. The brackets and the columns and all those things, the structural and beautiful ornamentation, right? The ornamentation was the functionality versus the house on the left, which who knows what that is? I mean, it's just an oriel window and a thing on the side and the garage over on the left, cheap materials, and there is no design philosophy there except the most house for the least amount of money, and it's a problem. So I think that if I was going to be a home inspector, the things that I would be most anxious by is certainly the DIY world and what's going on with that, faulty build signs, I was talking to Mike about that, and then poorly designed details and execution of those details because we've forgotten how to do a gable end return, because we've forgotten how to pitch a windowsill so that it sheds water, because we've forgotten how to freaking build. This is a 1950s Time magazine. Guys coming back from, this is really when they say the DIY movement started. A lot of guys coming back from the war that were used to fixing things, used to using Jeeps to build stuff and do everything, wanted to get access to build things in their house. And so this, you see that tool sales of 3 million, 39, 10 times that after World War II. There is nothing wrong with DIY, right? There's nothing wrong with wanting to build it yourself. The problem is, in my opinion, is that a lot of the products that we put on our houses today are geared towards the DIY audience, geared to be snap in place, geared to be, I can do this on a weekend, and we've kind of lost this sense of quality construction. So the products that we see in Home Depot, the products that are advertised on HGTV and the Magnolia Network are about, look how fast I did this, look how quick this is, look how easy, look how I changed this space, look at my accent wall. And we've just lost this sense of architecture, beauty, things that last a long time. There's a lot of MDF going in houses today. That's a real problem. So I appreciate the DIY world. I just fear the flippers and the DIY people who really don't know what they're doing and are making big mistakes on houses that are going to cost a lot of money. You know I have opinions about stuff. The build science is one of them, and I don't think we've figured this out yet. And what I don't think we've figured it out is that we're making our houses super tight, but the HVAC contractors, the vent fans that we put in our bathrooms, the contractors that design and organize these HVAC spaces, the window companies, no one's on the same page. There is no standard for for how these things should be put together. So the HVAC companies are making the most energy efficient pieces they can, but they're being geared towards houses that are either too tight or have the wrong products in them. And I'm hearing stories of people closing their front door and their windows popping out. And I'm hearing stories of gas lights on water heaters being blown out because the vent fan comes on, and so it sucks all the air out of the house. We just haven't figured out how to do it. I was telling these guys at lunch, I got scared about open cell foam insulation because I had two jobs that 4 years on one and probably 5 years on another, I got called back, and the homeowner looked at it and he says, "Why is that rotting?" And so we were like, "I don't know." Open up this thing, and probably what looked like a 6x6 area was about a 6x6 area, all of rotted wood because the open cell foam had held the water and just couldn't dry out. And the other one was the open cell foam had come off the wall and was actually going down the inside of the wall and running across the floor, and their floors were buckling. All of the things that were hidden to me by any kind of FLIR gun, any kind of moisture meter, we couldn't look at the wall and figure out what was going on. And so I think building energy efficient houses is the right thing to do. We just haven't figured out how to do it. I've got a builder buddy who builds 1,000 houses a year, a production builder. And he's bragging to me about how he's getting this rebate from the state of Texas for blowing foam into his houses. And all I'm thinking is there's a lawsuit waiting for that thing because the HVAC contractors are certainly not looking at those houses saying, well, you're not getting these many air cycles and the way you're opening your windows or not opening your windows. It's just not thought out. No one is designing and organizing those systems in that level of houses. And I believe that we are going to have, I call it the asbestos of our time, because I think that there's going to be 5 years, maybe 10 at the most. There are going to be people stepping through the roofs of their house wondering, why is my roof rotted? And it's because it's been holding water. Why am I unhealthy? Why can't I breathe in my own house? What's going on? And it's because of these issues. That's the Brent Hull thing. I know I'm kind of out there, but that's what I fear. And I think I'm surprised that there wasn't more foam fears from you guys as I was just talking around the group. There's a few, but it's a big problem that I'm really anxious about. And then the last thing is just what happens tomorrow. What happens with housing and where do we go? And I think, I read an article this morning talking that Walmart had 3D printed one of their stores. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal. And so they are figuring that 3D printing is just something that they need to be on top of. And they built a 10,000 square foot warehouse, new store with 3D printing. Is that the future? They're doing a 3D printed community in Texas, every house being 3D printed. So there are advancements. There are people trying to solve the housing crisis, trying to solve these with kind of newfangled technology that we haven't figured out yet. We just aren't on top of. And so whether prefab happens, there's been so many, if anybody followed the Katana story, was it Katira maybe. It was a Silicon Valley company that was going to solve the housing crisis because they were taking a Silicon Valley approach to designing houses. And of course, they went bankrupt. But there's been a number of people trying to solve this and realize that Frank Lloyd Wright was doing Usonian houses in the early 1900s, 1930s. And so trying to solve this issue of how do we make houses work. That's why, Levittown's so intriguing to me, is because he basically did figure out, going with the smaller sizes, changing the way, that we build and think about building. Yes, it changed houses. I don't like the results, but home ownership went from, I think it was like 40% to now it's about 62%. So, more people get into houses. And I'm an architectural snob, so I realize I got to shut up. But that's a good thing. More people living in their own houses, that's a good thing. And so, how do we solve this? I do think it's an Elon Musk kind of thing that comes out. I don't think tiny houses are the future, but there is a prefab, 3D printed solution out there that I think we're going to be looking at in the coming, years that will affect housing, and I think will affect you guys. But it's going to be new products that we're not used to seeing. It's going to be, how to think about those things in a, what's going to last a long time. And so it's hard.